Hello, and welcome to the first of two lectures on the English Renaissance and the English Reformations. Yes, that's plural, Reformations. We'll discuss that in more detail in the second lecture in this series. We're now moving from the thin blue anthology to the orange volume B, the fattest book in the whole 6-volume Norton Anthology to English Literature, the 16th century and the early 17th century. Why is this particular volume of literature so thick? I'm not on the Norton editorial board, but I'd guess that it's because English as a language and as a body of literature was rapidly developing during this time, and this is when some of the most iconic writers, thinkers, and rulers lived and wrote. You see here in this opening slide two Renaissance men of importance, Jean de Montville, the French ambassador to Henry VIII's court in 1533, and his friend Georges de Selve, a bishop and a scholar. These men were visiting Henry VIII, the same year that he divorced Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn. So it was certainly an interesting time to be visiting England, and that's just what we'll find reflected in the literature of the 16th and early 17th centuries. In this wide-ranging lecture, I'll give you an overview of the broad cultural strokes, the Renaissance as it was expressed in England, the English rulers of this time period, and the Reformations that had such a profound effect on the country. This is by no means an exhaustive exploration of the time period. We don't have time to do this in a survey course, but I hope you'll enjoy the literature we'll read in the next week. We'll also be moving from looking in depth at one work to looking at quite a few smaller works. From Thomas More's Utopia to comparing translations of the Bible in English to looking into the minds of some fascinating female rulers, you can certainly mark this unit down as one of the most varied. This will also be the pattern when we study the poetry of this time period in Unit 6. I'd like to start off with a brief word about terminology. In the next few units, you'll likely hear me to refer to this time period, roughly 1500 to 1700 in England, as both the Renaissance and the early modern period. Since we're at the start of a new volume of the Norton, it's time to frame the terminology, just like we did with Anglo-Saxon versus Old English or early medieval. The term Renaissance was coined in the 1800s, so it is not a contemporaneous term in our time period of study. Typically, when people use this term, they are referring to the re-engagement with certain Greek works that began in the 14th century, first in Italy and then elsewhere. This term implies elitism, but it also subtly argues that nothing of any importance went on in the Middle Ages, where, as we've seen in the last 2 weeks, many creative and intelligent writers were wrestling with all kinds of topics. Many specialists in this time period, of which I am one, prefer the term early modern nowadays. This term was first introduced in the 1940s and is more inclusive. Instead of just caring about the paintings made for the Pope or literature written for the ruling class, early modern studies looks at all kinds of material production. However, these terms are still used interchangeably. I'm the president of the Renaissance Drama section of the South Central Modern Language Association, for instance. I just wanted you to know that if you hear the word early modern, it is synonymous with Renaissance in this class. What was the Renaissance? Let's refresh you first by showing you a typical work of the time period, The School of Athens by Raphael, painted in 1509. You can see here that Raphael is depicting all sorts of important Greek philosophers and mathematicians and writers interacting together. By the way, that guy in purple with his head down at the very foreground, right above the words of Athens, is the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, but the model for him is Michelangelo, who painted the Sistine Chapel and sculpted David. The central figure at the top of the stairs in the red cloak overlaying the purple toga is Plato, who is modeled on Leonardo da Vinci, the famous painter of the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, and numerous other works. So you can see how Raphael is using icons of ancient Greece to make the argument that his work will be just as impactful, and how he's tying closely the work that he's doing in the early 16th century with the work being done in ancient times in Greece. Just in case it's been a while since world history, I thought I'd refresh your memory on the main thrust of the Renaissance. The big takeaway here is a return to humanism, or the study of the nature of humanity and its relation to the natural world. The difference between the scholarship in the Middle Ages and the scholarship in the Renaissance was that in the Renaissance, which means rebirth, the focus was on man, and in the Middle Ages, the understanding was that God was the main goal of science and philosophy. The epicenter of the Renaissance, where it all began, so to speak, was the city of Florence in the Tuscany region of what is now Italy. And Florence continued to be an important city for artists, architects, music composers, and writers. In the last lecture, I mentioned that Chaucer had been to Italy in the 1300s and encountered the great Italian Renaissance writers Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio there. Chaucer returned to a country that would not experience its own Renaissance until much later, in the late 15th century. Why did England lag in Renaissance scholarship and production? Quite simply, they were too busy fighting the 100 Years' War with France and then the War of Roses with themselves. The War of Roses was fought between two rival factions, the Yorkists, whose symbol was the white rose, and the Lancastrians, who were symbolized by red roses. The politics of late medieval and early modern England make today's kerfuffles between Democrats and Republicans look like play fighting. Just look at this list of rulers in the 15th century, and I didn't even bother to go into how Henry IV came to power in the previous century. Henry VI, who was a child king, reigned from 1422 to 1461. He was deposed by Edward IV, a Yorkist, in 1461, and Edward reigned until 1470, when he was briefly deposed by Henry VI, before taking up the reins of rule again in 1471 until 1483. When Edward IV died of natural causes, his son, Edward V, was too young to assume personal rule. Also, England didn't like having boy kings. What happens in the situation of a boy king is that the advisors will jockey for power and cause problems, as they did under Henry VI. However, young King Edward V disappears while living in the Tower of London, where monarchs traditionally go to await their coronations. If you've ever heard conspiracy theories about the princes in the tower, or you're all out of conspiracy theories during COVID and want a new one to investigate, then this is the one for you. It's quite fascinating, and there are all kinds of theories. The main understanding is that these princes mysteriously disappear, Edward V and his brother, the Duke of York, and at some point their uncle, Richard III, takes over, taking control of the government for a few years. Richard III is despised by many who accuse him of murdering the princes. But if you ever visit York in northern England, you'll see they quite like him there. Henry Tudor, someone marginally connected to the English royal bloodline via his mother, Margaret Beaufort, sails to England and fights for the Lancastrian cause. Richard III dies on the battlefield at Bosworth in 1483, and you get Henry VII. You can see why Shakespeare made so many plays about late medieval history, and why George R.R. Martin of Game of Thrones fame was inspired to write his long and unfinished series of novels based on the War of the Roses. So you can see why people in England didn't have much spare time for the Renaissance until the very end of the 15th century. That very year the War of Roses ended, and Caxton printed Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. The English language is gaining in prestige, and many writers are choosing to pen their works in the vernacular instead of Latin. Thomas More arises as the preeminent English humanist in the early 16th century, and he shares close personal friendship with Dutch humanist Erasmus. Roger Ascham, another famous English humanist from a bit later in the century, becomes a personal tutor of both Lady Jane Grey and later Elizabeth I. This was a time period when more and more people were going to school. Although girls did not attend school per se, some families of means were paying private tutors to educate their daughters in some of the same subjects as their sons: Greek, Latin, rhetoric, etc. However, many young girls concentrated more on modern languages and feminine accomplishments like needlework in their studies. Both of Roger Ascham's famous pupils, Lady Jane and Queen Elizabeth, did him credit, by the way. Another change to note was a linguistic one. The Great Vowel Shift occurred from 1400 to 1700. The English spoken in this time period moves away from Chaucer's Middle English and towards more silent letters. The pronunciation of vowels changes as well, meaning the placement in the mouth was different. If you're curious about this process and the change of English language and how it was pronounced, see the resources at the end of this lecture note for a video. Let's get back to the rulers of England during this time period. As I said before, Henry VII was the first Tudor king. After the dust cleared in the War of Roses, Henry VII was able to stabilize England. He cemented his rather dubious claim to the throne by marrying Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York. Some folks say that it is her, modeling for the Queen of Hearts, by the way, in the standard deck of cards, but I can't corroborate this. Henry consolidated power centrally in the court, a feat he was able to accomplish because other nobles were practically decimated from all that fighting in the War of Roses, which Henry VII spent most of it camped out in France. Henry VII wasn't a warm and fuzzy king, but he did bring England into a time of relative peace, and he rebuilt the state treasury with his frugal ways. If you're interested in this time period, I suggest watching the Starz series The White Princess to get a sense of all the scheming and the Princess of the Tower conspiracy. Just remember it's historical fiction. It was also during this time period that the English language was coming into prominence and English literature was gaining more prestige. Caxton and his printing press published Chaucer, as well as Sir Thomas Malory, but they don't publish Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This is due, remember, to the dialect in which the pieces were written. I'm going to mix in my discussion of the English rulers in the early modern era with a discussion of the Reformation. I'll start with an early reformer active in the 14th century, John Wycliffe, a theology professor at Oxford University. Wycliffe was concerned with the corruption that he saw in the Roman Catholic Church of his day. He's a contemporary of Chaucer, and you get little snippets of some of Chaucer's clergyman characters in The Wife of Bath's tale, as they interrupt the wife as she's trying to explain her background. In general, Chaucer concurs with Wycliffe's characterization of a corrupt church. It's just that Chaucer was content to lampoon the priests, and Wycliffe tended toward more drastic measures. Wycliffe argued against the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that the host and the wine actually turn into the body and blood of Christ during communion, and he also began translating the Bible into English. He died of a stroke at age 54. The church powers were so angry at the trouble he kicked off that they exhumed his body and burned his bones posthumously at the stake some 50 years after his actual death. The followers of Wycliffe were known as Lollards, and they existed in England from the mid-1300s until the 1530s, when the German-born Reformation movement began filtering into England. Their beliefs on communion, consubstantiation, especially aligned with those of Martin Luther and with Lutherans today. I just want to briefly mention another early reformer, Jan Hus, who lived from 1380 aroundabouts to 1415. Jan Hus was a Bohemian priest who adopted some of Wycliffe's ideas. At the time, priests were not serving communion in both kinds to their flock. They were giving the bread but withholding the wine. Huss thought that this was wrong, and he also criticized holding the Mass in Latin. Huss believed that the Mass should be celebrated in the vernacular language. He was burned at the stake in 1415. It wasn't until Martin Luther came on the scene that reform movements got enough traction to change the hearts and minds of rulers. I've got a link at the top of this slide to a very fine documentary on Martin Luther made by Rick Steves, the guy that makes those European travel videos. This was made in 2017 in commemoration of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So why did Luther succeed when these other earlier folks failed? One reason is that Luther was able to take advantage of the printing press and movable type, which German goldsmith Johannes Gutenberg had operational by 1450. But there were several other reasons that Luther was in the right place at the right time. The Catholic Church in the 1510s was engaged in a massive building campaign in Rome. If you've ever been to St. Peter's, that's what they were trying to build, so you can imagine the Pope needed a lot of money. In order to fundraise, the Pope sent preachers around selling indulgences, or time-off tickets from purgatory. The princes were not happy with the church having more power and money than they did, and also the Pope was particularly targeting the German states. Germany was not an actual country in and of itself by the time. When theology professor and monk Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses against the selling of indulgences and tacked it up on the castle church door on October 31st, 1517, he could not have chosen a better location or time. Luther was protected by the powerful Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise. He was able to take advantage of the mass communication that came with the printing press, and his ideas spread rapidly throughout Europe. Someone who was at the right time, but not the right place, was William Tyndale, who, like Wycliffe before him, believed in translating the Bible into the vernacular. He translated the New Testament and some of the Old Testament into English before he died, and his associate Miles Coverdale completed the project. Tyndale's language was very influential. He coined phrases like salt of the earth and eat, drink, and be merry in his Bible translation. His work was called the Great Bible and was completed and published in 1539. Later, a revised version called the Bishop's Bible was used in churches during Elizabeth's reign. Tyndale died in 1536, a victim of Protestant persecution. I'm also going to briefly mention John Calvin, who was a Frenchman by birth, but who made his home in Geneva, Switzerland for many years. His main contribution to Protestantism was the idea of predestination, and he greatly influenced the Puritan segment of English Protestants, as well as Scottish Protestants like John Knox. We will see Shakespeare lampooning Puritans in Twelfth Night, the play that we will be reading in Unit 7 and Unit 8. That's all for Unit 1, or Part 1 of this two-part lecture on the backgrounds, the Renaissance, Reformations, and rulers of the 16th and early 17th century.